My grandchildren said I was too slow and embarrassing to be seen with them in public. What they didn't know was that the beachfront property they loved visiting every summer wasn't their parents' house. It was mine, and I was about to teach them a lesson about respect. The Hawaiian sunrise painted the Pacific in shades of gold and coral as I made my way down to the beach with my walking cane, the same one I'd been using since my hip replacement 2 years ago. The sand was cool beneath my feet, and the sound of gentle waves promised another beautiful day in paradise. I'd been looking forward to our traditional morning beach walk, something I'd shared with my grandchildren every summer for the past 8 years. That's when I heard the voices coming from the lanai of my beachfront home, sharp, dismissive, and painfully familiar. "Do we really have to wait for Grandma Malia?" My 17-year-old granddaughter Kayla's voice carried on the morning breeze. "She takes forever with that cane, and we'll miss the good waves." "I know, right?" My 15-year-old grandson Tyler chimed in. "It's so embarrassing when she tries to keep up with us. Yesterday, that cute girl from the resort was totally checking me out until Grandma showed up hobbling along." My daughter Linda's voice was lower, but I could still make out her words. "Kids, keep your voices down. She might hear you." So what if she does? This was my son-in-law David, never one to filter his thoughts. "Malia needs to face reality. She's 78 years old, Linda. She can barely make it down the beach path without stopping to rest 3 times. Maybe it's time she started staying behind and letting us younger folks enjoy the beach properly." I stood there in the morning light, my heart sinking with each word. This was my family, the people I'd invited to spend 2 weeks in my Hawaiian home every summer, the ones I'd watched grow up, taught to swim in these very waters, and spoiled with the kind of vacation most families could only dream of. "But what if she gets upset?" Linda asked, though her tone suggested she was already convinced. "She'll get over it," David said dismissively. "Besides, we're only here for another week. Do we really want to spend it walking at turtle speed and pretending we're having fun?" 12-year-old Emma, the youngest of my grandchildren, spoke up with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "Maybe Grandma could just stay by the pool. She likes sitting in the shade anyway, and then we could actually have fun on the beach without worrying about her falling or getting tired." I made my way back up the path to the house, each step feeling heavier than the last, not because of my hip, but because of the weight of what I'd just heard. When I reached the lanai, the conversation stopped abruptly, and 5 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from guilty to defiant. "Good morning, Tutu," Kayla said, using the Hawaiian word for grandmother that she'd learned as a child, but her voice was strained, artificial. "We were just planning out the day." "I heard," I said quietly, settling into my usual chair at the outdoor table. "And it sounds like those plans don't include me." The silence that followed was deafening. David was the first to break it, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought he was being helpful. "Malia, we're just concerned about you overexerting yourself. You've been doing so much to make this vacation special for all of us. Maybe you should take a day or relax." "A day to relax," I repeated, looking out at the beach where I'd walked every morning for the past 15 years since moving to this house. In my own home. "It's not that we don't want you with us," Linda said quickly, though her eyes wouldn't meet mine. "It's just that we want everyone to enjoy their vacation. The kids have limited time here, and they want to make the most of it." Tyler, emboldened by his parents' words, leaned forward in his chair. "Grandma, no offense, but you kind of slow everything down. Like yesterday when we wanted to walk to the tide pools, it took us an hour to get there because we had to keep stopping." "And we missed the dolphins," Emma added, as if this were somehow my fault. "The tour guide said they only come close to shore in the morning, but we were so late because of, you know." Kayla nodded enthusiastically. "Plus, some of my friends from school are staying at the resort down the beach. I was hoping to hang out with them, but it's kinda weird when I'm with my grandmother who needs a walking stick." The words hit me like physical blows. I looked at each of their faces, my daughter who'd grown up swimming in these waters, My son-in-law who'd proposed to her on this very beach. My grandchildren who'd learned to build sandcastles in my backyard. They were sitting in my home, eating breakfast I'd prepared, planning to spend the day on my private beach, and complaining that my presence was inconvenient. I see, I said finally. So you'd prefer if I stayed behind? Just for today, Linda said quickly. You could read a book, maybe take a nap. You always say how much you love the view from the house. The view from the house that I can't enjoy because I'm too slow and embarrassing to leave it. David's face reddened slightly. That's not what we're saying, Malia. We're saying that maybe it would be better for everyone if you took it easy today. What happened next still makes my heart ache when I think about it. My family, the people I loved most in the world, spent the next 20 minutes explaining to me why my presence was a burden. They used gentle words and caring tones, but the message was clear. I was too old, too slow, and too much of an embarrassment to be included in their vacation activities. Kayla pulled out her phone and started showing me pictures from previous days. See, Grandma, look how much ground we covered when we went exploring without you on Tuesday. We found that hidden cove with the sea turtles and made it all the way to the lighthouse. And we actually got to swim, Tyler added, instead of just sitting on the beach watching you rest in the shade. Emma, trying to be helpful, suggested activities I could do alone. You could make those flower arrangements you like, or maybe call your book club friends back home. Didn't you say Mrs. Patterson wanted to hear about Hawaii? Each suggestion felt like another reminder that I was surplus to requirements, a burden to be managed rather than a person to be included. But the worst part came when David pulled out his tablet and started showing me photos from their previous day's adventure, the day they'd gone exploring while I stayed home with what I thought was the flu, but which I now realized had been their first experiment in excluding me. Look how much fun everyone had, he said, swiping through pictures of my family laughing, playing in the waves, and exploring tide pools. No one had to worry about keeping up or taking breaks. The kids got to be kids. Linda leaned over to look at the photos, smiling at the memories. It was nice to not have to worry about whether you were getting tired or if the sun was too strong for you. And I got to wear my new bikini without worrying about Grandma judging me, Kayla added, apparently forgetting that I was sitting right there. Tyler laughed. Remember when we found that rope swing? We never would have made it that far down the beach with Grandma. I sat there listening to them describe a vacation within a vacation, one where my absence had been a relief rather than a loss. They talked about freedom and fun and spontaneity, all things that apparently became impossible when I was around. As if the conversation wasn't painful enough, David then pulled out a folder of papers that I recognized with a sinking heart. These were documents I'd seen him reviewing earlier in the week, papers he'd claimed were just vacation planning stuff. Actually, Malia, he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, there's something else we wanted to discuss with you while we're all here together. He opened the folder and pulled out what looked like real estate documents and legal papers. My chest tightened as I realized what this conversation was really about. We've been talking about the future of this house, Linda said, her voice carefully neutral. David and I have been looking into the property values in this area, and we think it might be time to consider some changes. Changes, I repeated, though I was beginning to understand exactly what kind of changes they had in mind. Mom, you're not getting any younger, Linda continued, using the same gentle but firm tone she'd used when convincing me I shouldn't drive at night anymore. This house is beautiful, but it's also a lot of responsibility. The maintenance, the property taxes, the insurance, it's a huge financial burden for someone on a fixed income. David nodded, pulling out what looked like property tax statements and maintenance records. We've done some research, and we estimate that keeping this place costs you at least $40,000 a year. That's a significant chunk of your retirement savings. Tyler, apparently thinking this was helpful, chimed in with his own observation. Plus, Grandma, you barely use most of the house. Like the guest bedrooms just sit empty for most of the year, and you hardly ever use the pool anymore. And the beach access is kind of wasted if you can't really walk on the beach much, Emma added with the thoughtless cruelty that only children can achieve. Kayla, not to be outdone, pulled out her own phone. I've been looking at some really nice senior living communities in California. They have pools and activities and people your own age. You might actually be happier somewhere like that. I stared at my granddaughter, the child I'd taught to snorkel in my lagoon, who'd spent countless summers building fairy houses in my garden, as she showed me pictures of institutional living facilities with artificial recreation and supervised activities. The best part, David continued, clearly warming to his subject, is that selling this place would give you enough money to live comfortably anywhere you want. Plus, it would take a huge burden off your shoulders. And off ours, Linda added quietly, though not quietly enough. What my family didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was how I'd actually come to own this property. They'd always assumed that I'd inherited it from my late husband Robert, or that we'd bought it together as a retirement investment. The truth was much more complicated and much more impressive than anything they'd imagined. I'd purchased this beachfront home in 1995, 5 years before Robert's death, with money I'd earned entirely on my own. While Robert had been focused on his career as a high school principal, I'd been quietly building a business that none of them knew about. It started with selling traditional Hawaiian quilts to tourists from our small apartment in Honolulu. I'd learned the craft from my grandmother, who'd learned it from hers, and what began as a hobby had slowly grown into something much larger. By the 1980s, I was designing and creating custom quilts for high-end hotels and resorts throughout the Hawaiian Islands. But the real money had come from something completely unexpected: real estate development. In the early 1990s, I'd partnered with a group of native Hawaiian investors to develop sustainable, culturally appropriate housing on the outer islands. Our company, which I'd helped found with my quilt earnings, had been responsible for 3 major resort developments that honored traditional Hawaiian architecture and land use practices. When we sold the company in 1994, my share of the profits was just over $2 million. I'd used $800,000 of that to buy this house, another $600,000 to set up a trust fund for my grandchildren's education, and the rest to create an investment portfolio that had been growing steadily for the past 3 decades. The house they were so eager to sell wasn't a burden on my fixed income. It was paid for entirely, and the rental income from the guest cottage alone covered all the maintenance costs. The property taxes and insurance that David was so concerned about amounted to less than 5% of my annual investment income. But I'd never told them any of this. I'd let them believe I was a simple grandmother living off her husband's pension and Social Security, because I'd wanted them to love me for who I was, not what I owned. Apparently, even that hadn't been enough. Before we go any further with this conversation, I said quietly, I need to ask you something, Linda. My daughter looked up from the papers David had spread across the table, her expression wary. What is it, Mom? Who do you think owns this house? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Well, you do, obviously. But Mom, that's exactly why we're having this conversation. You own something that's become too much for you to handle. Too much for me to handle, I repeated, looking around at the property I'd maintained and improved for nearly 30 years. Based on what, exactly? David leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone people use when they think they're explaining something to someone who doesn't understand. Malia, we can see how hard it is for you to keep up with everything. The yard work, the house maintenance, even simple things like walking on the beach. This place requires more energy than you have. And it's not just the physical stuff, Kayla added, apparently feeling qualified to comment on my financial situation despite being 17 years old. It's like super expensive to maintain a house like this. Wouldn't you rather have that money to spend on things you actually enjoy? I stood up slowly, using my cane for support, and walked to the sliding door that led into the main house. I think it's time you all learned something about this property that you've been taking for granted. Mom, what are you doing? Linda asked, following me into the house. I made my way to the home office that had once been Robert's study, the room where I kept all my important papers and financial documents. The family trailed behind me, clearly puzzled by my sudden change in demeanor. From the filing cabinet, I pulled out a folder that I'd been maintaining for 30 years, the complete financial history of this property, including the original purchase documents, all improvement receipts, and the current property valuation. Sit down, I said, returning to the living room where the morning light was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Pacific. All of you. They arranged themselves around the coffee table like reluctant students called to the principal's office. I spread out the documents methodically, the same way I'd once laid out quilt patterns before cutting the fabric. This house was purchased on July 15, 1995, I began, pointing to the deed, for $650,000. It was purchased by Malia Akamu Chen with funds earned through the sale of Pacific Isle Development Company. David picked up the deed, his eyes scanning the legal language. Pacific Isle Development Company? I've never heard of that. Because you never asked, I said simply. You all assumed that this house was something that happened to me rather than something I made happen. What followed was perhaps the most satisfying 20 minutes of my life. I watched my family's faces change from condescending concern to shocked disbelief as I laid out the complete story of my business career. I showed them the incorporation papers for Pacific Isle Development, where I was listed as a founding partner and major shareholder. I showed them the contracts for our 3 resort developments, each one worth tens of millions of dollars. I showed them the sale documents from 1994 with my signature next to a check for $2.1 million. You built resorts? Emma asked, her 12-year-old mind struggling to reconcile the image of her slow, elderly grandmother with that of a successful businesswoman. I helped build them, I corrected. I designed the cultural elements, managed the traditional crafts programs, and ensured that each development honored Hawaiian traditions while providing modern amenities. Tyler was staring at the financial documents like they were written in a foreign language. But Grandma, you never told us you were rich. I'm not rich, I said, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. I'm comfortable. There's a difference. Linda was reading through the investment portfolio statements I'd pulled from another folder, her eyes growing wider with each page. Mom, these numbers, is this real? It's real, I confirmed. The house is paid off and has been since 1998. The property generates rental income from the guest cottage that covers all maintenance and taxes. The investment portfolio provides more than enough for my living expenses, with plenty left over for things like annual vacations for ungrateful family members. The last comment hung in the air like a challenge. David was the first to respond, his voice much smaller than it had been an hour earlier. Malia, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I own, I said simply. I wanted our relationships to be based on affection and respect, not on what you might inherit someday. Kayla looked up from her phone, where she'd apparently been Googling Pacific Isle Development. Grandma, it says here that your company was responsible for some of the most successful eco-friendly resorts in Hawaii. You're like famous in the sustainable tourism industry. Was famous, I corrected. I retired 25 years ago. But you could have told us, Linda said, her voice small and hurt. We're your family. I tried to tell you in other ways, I said. Every time I offered to pay for something, every time I insisted on covering vacation expenses, every time I suggested improvements to this house that I somehow managed to afford on my fixed income. But you were all so busy assuming I was helpless that you never stopped to wonder how a helpless person could maintain a property like this. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced with my family. For the first time in years, they were truly listening to me, not just waiting for their turn to speak or planning how to manage my supposed limitations. So, I said, gathering up the papers and returning them to their folders, let's revisit this morning's conversation about how I'm too slow and embarrassing to be seen with. The guilt on their faces was palpable. Kayla was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Grandma, we didn't mean it the way it sounded. Didn't you? I asked, because it sounded like you were ashamed of me. Like my physical limitations somehow made me less worthy of your time and attention. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It's not that we're ashamed of you. It's just that, well, you do walk kinda slow. I walk slow because I had hip replacement surgery 2 years ago, I said firmly. Surgery that was necessary because I spent 60 years working on my feet, building quilts and businesses and a life that could provide opportunities for my family. This cane isn't a sign of weakness. It's evidence of a life well lived. David cleared his throat, his face red with embarrassment. Malia, we owe you an apology. We had no right to make assumptions about your capabilities or your finances. You had no right to make me feel unwelcome in my own home, I corrected. You had no right to plan a vacation within my vacation, where my absence was celebrated rather than mourned. Linda was crying now, quiet tears that spoke of genuine remorse. Mom, we were terrible. We got so caught up in wanting to have fun that we forgot the most important thing about these trips, spending time with you. Did you? I asked. Or did you come here because you enjoy my house, my beach, and my hospitality, and I just happened to come with the package? The question hung in the air like an accusation, because in many ways, that's exactly what it was. Emma, in the way that only children can, cut straight to the heart of the matter. Grandma, are you going to kick us out? I looked at my youngest granddaughter, seeing myself in her dark eyes and the stubborn set of her chin. What do you think I should do, Emma? She considered this seriously. I think you should make us earn the right to stay. Like, maybe we should have to do chores or something to pay you back for being mean. Out of the mouths of babes. That's an interesting idea, I said. What kind of chores did you have in mind? Well, Emma said, warming to the subject, maybe Tyler and I could help you with your garden. And Kayla could help you organize your photo albums. And Mom and Dad could do all the cooking and cleaning for the rest of the trip. And what about the beach walks? I asked. Emma's face lit up. We could take turns being your walking buddy. Like each day, one of us gets to go slow with you and learn about the things you point out. I bet you know lots of cool stuff about the beach that we miss when we're rushing around. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of hurt that had been tightening all morning. You know what, Emma? I think that's a very fair proposal. For the rest of our vacation, everything changed. Each morning, one family member took a slow walk with me, and for the first time in years, they actually listened when I pointed out the monk seals basking on the rocks, or explained which clouds meant rain was coming, or told them stories about the Hawaiian legends connected to different parts of the coastline. Kayla learned that her great-great-grandmother had been a traditional Hawaiian quilt master, and she spent hours listening to stories about our family history that she'd never bothered to ask about before. Tyler discovered that I knew the names and habits of every bird species on the island, knowledge I'd gained during decades of early morning beach walks. Emma found out that I could identify edible plants and had once taken a survival course that taught me to find fresh water and build shelter from palm fronds. Linda and David, meanwhile, gained a new appreciation for the complexity of maintaining a property like this, as well as a healthy respect for the business acumen that had made it all possible. But the most important thing that happened was that they stopped seeing me as a burden to be managed and started seeing me as a person with her own fascinating history, hard-won wisdom, and valuable contributions to make. By the end of the vacation, when it was time for them to return to California, the conversation was completely different. "Mom," Linda said as we sat on the lanai watching the sunset, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition. You built something amazing here, and instead of celebrating that, we made you feel like you were a problem to be solved. And I promise," Kayla added, "that I'll never be embarrassed to be seen with you again. If anything, I want people to know that my grandmother is a total badass who built resorts and owns beachfront property and knows more about Hawaii than most tour guides." Tyler nodded enthusiastically. "Plus, the slow walks were actually way cooler than rushing around. I saw more stuff in 1 week with you than I had in all our previous visits combined." David, ever practical, had his own realization. "Malia, I hope you know that we'll never bring up selling this house again. This is your home, your legacy, and your sanctuary. We're honored that you share it with us." As I watched my family pack their bags and prepare to leave, I reflected on the lesson we'd all learned that week. They'd discovered that their assumptions about age, ability, and worth were not only wrong, but harmful. And I'd learned that sometimes the people who love you most need to be reminded of your value, not because they don't care, but because they've forgotten to look beyond the surface. My grandchildren had called me too slow and embarrassing to be seen with in public. What they discovered was that the beachfront property they loved visiting every summer wasn't their parents' house, it was mine. And the slow old lady they were ashamed of was actually the strong young woman who'd built the life they were privileged to enjoy. Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in the most painful packages. And sometimes the most important thing you can teach your family is that respect isn't something you lose with age. It's something you earn through a lifetime of choices, and something they should be grateful to witness, cane and all.